Hello and welcome to this edition of Talk Time. I'm Paranjoy Guha Thakurta in the studio of Lok Sabha Television here in New Delhi. In this edition of the program, we are looking at inequalities, social, economic inequalities, inequalities of income, inequalities of wealth. We are looking at inequalities across the globe, and we are looking at inequalities in India. With me here in the studio, let me welcome Dr. Sreeram Chaulia, and currently Dean of the Jindal School of International Affairs. Your recent article in Asian Age, Deccan Chronicle, you talked about the obscene nature of the sharp division, the widening of the inequalities between the haves and the have-nots across the world. And you're saying even if the poor are not getting poorer, to turn that cliche a little bit, tweak it a little bit, but the gap between the rich and the poor have certainly widened across the globe. And you quote that it's even the International Monetary Fund, which, as you say, is not exactly a great friend or ideological friend of the poor. And not just economists like Joseph Stiglitz and others who are highlighting the consequences of this rise, as you say, the obscene inequalities across the globe. Maybe you'd like to add to what you've written.
Yeah, Paranjoy, the reason why the IMF and the World Bank are now going after inequality and highlighting it as a major problem is because they realize that there's this huge slump and there's no means to rebuild consumer demand unless you raise wages and raise living standards of the middle and the working classes. So it's a more of a utilitarian reason why even those on the right of the spectrum are now talking about inequality, because they know that they cannot recreate the kind of consumption and spending by average citizens unless average citizens are better off. And we know that in the last 30 years of the neoliberal era, wages have mostly remained stagnant or have declined if you adjust them to inflation. So real incomes have not risen very much. And on the other hand, the top 1 percentile, as the Occupy Wall Street used to call it, the 99 versus 1%, they have accumulated enormously, and the freedom to move capital across borders without restrictions, without political state control over it, which is what we call financial globalization, is at the core of this whole process of unequal accumulation of wealth. And on the other hand, you have the rest of the masses who have been in a way, they're standing on their shoulders, because at the end of the day, the financial sector, which has been at the core of accumulation, depends upon productive activities lower down the chain.
In your column, you go back literally thousands of years. You quote the studies done by an anthropologist from the University of Michigan, Ken Flannery, Joyce Marcus. You talk about Marx, you talk about Rousseau, and you talk about if you go back in time and look at how human society has evolved over the thousands of years. At what stage are we in today? I mean, you have argued that in some ways things have deteriorated.
See, I think we have to question the whole notion of materialist progress, because it's based on a notion of linear and successively marching towards some kind of better horizons. But if you look at inequality, for example, which is such a central issue today, it's a lot worse than it was 50 or 100 or 500 years ago. And the reason is we have normalized this within societies and across the transnational space. We have normalized it by saying globalization, the ones who have the most skills, the most knowledge, and who are in the right place at the right time, they are the ones who will obviously benefit. And if you want to be there, you get the skills, get the education, get upward social mobility. But the reality is that there is no upward social mobility, especially in advanced economies which have been suffering in the last 5 years. Even in some of the so-called intermediate or least developed countries, you don't see that much upward mobility happening. So where are the opportunities? I mean, if America is a land of opportunities, how can wages stagnate for 30 years? And so on one hand, you have stagnant wages and flat living conditions. On the other hand, you have policies to bail out these major firms, and again the burden is being transferred onto the shoulders and the backs of the poor and the middle working class.
The intervention of the state to reduce inequalities, because if you depend on the philanthropy, so to say, of the private corporate sector, it's never going to work, because their goal is to maximize profit. So under the circumstances, the nature of intervention of the state and about the diminishing of the power of the sovereign state itself. A few comments from you.
There are a few instruments through which the state's capacities were weakened and made to fail. The first one was making it easy for capital to flow across borders without much political control over it.
That big shadow economy.
And so big money can always say, I'll vote with my feet. If you're not serving my interests, I'll go to another place. So this is the kind of arbitrage they did on a global scale. This is how they're able to move money easily and maximize their returns, evade taxes. The second instrument that was done was by creating this whole pseudo sector of NGOs and so on in order to take away a lot of social services away from elected governments into the hands of a lot of these foreign funded organizations. Many of them have corporate backing on a global scale. So this is where these are the two instruments. And then the third one, the way the state was weakened was by going to public choice theory and all these fancy items in the 70s and 80s from Milton Friedman onwards to delegitimize bureaucracy and government to the point where, yes, it has failed, but not to destroy it and make it collapse.
Dr. Chaulia, our whole notion of, what is modern is really accompanied by what you yourself said, the two most hideous features of the world we live in today, war and inequality.
Yeah, Paranjay, one of the things about modernity is it's actually been very closely associated with violence. And the reason is that it's a revolutionary philosophy in itself, because it talks about urbanization, industrialization, greater class stratification, and all of these are justified as necessary in order to move to another level of human existence.
You often hear this argument, if you want economic growth, there's bound to be inflation, there's bound to be inequality. People quote Simon Kuznets and others, it's seen as almost inevitable. And some people, by the way, also say corruption too. It's almost inevitable if you go.
Yeah, like in the 19th century, the Gilded Age, there were so many robber baron capitalists and there was a lot of corruption in America, and they say
Soviet Union, the oligarchs after the Soviet Union disintegrated.
But what these advocates don't realize is that from there to get to a cleaner system, it took a lot of people's struggles, and those are often left out. So that's why it's important to go back into the past to see how inequality was not natural. It was resisted by groups, communities, as well as individuals in some form or the other, violently or otherwise. And that is how we've been able to keep some check. But I'll just give you statistics. The CEO to worker pay ratio in the United States alone was 42 to 1 in 1980 when Reagan just came in. Today it is 204 to 1. Okay, so that's what I mean by
it's gone up like
fivefold.
Yes.
And this has become justified by arguing that, Marx never looked at the most important factor of production, which is organization, which is the ability to
innovate, animal spirits of entrepreneurs. We've been hearing
take risks, speculate, be greedy. All these are now part of this concoction where it is justified. The bonus culture, which has, of course, become vilified in the last 5 years because of the bailouts and the people's protests, because, we got sold out and the bankers got bailed out. So the bonus culture is now coming to public glare, but nonetheless, if you look at the CEO pay packets, there is a moral universe they've created where they justify it saying, look, it's not the worker, it's not really, the other factors of production. The most important one is capital and capital's ability to organize
again,
things.
This is again not new. If you go back 20 years ago, the famous film called Wall Street, Gordon Gekko, that character, greed is good. Greed is good.
Yeah.
But you're seeing that come to grotesque forms in the recent past.
Yeah, white-collar crimes. If you look at this, Paranjay, in the last 5 years since the crisis has emerged, white-collar crimes has become a respectable topic for mainstream organizations and those on the right to talk about, the power holders to talk about it, because it's hurt them badly and they want to try and control at least some aspects of it. But everybody knows that white-collar crime is in many ways the foundation upon which all these inequalities were built. So you'll have to change the legal systems altogether. The existing laws and the regulations are incomplete and inadequate to tackle white-collar crime.
I wanted you to look at, he's talked to what's happening in India, but you look at what's happening across the world. Many people said, 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall, early 90s, the disintegration of the Soviet Union, that this whole notion of what is capitalism, what is socialism, kind of got completely blurred. People like Fukuyama and all talked about the end of ideology, the end of history. Is China today a communist country? It is perhaps a state capitalist country. We don't call the Scandinavian countries like Norway and Sweden and Denmark as socialist countries, but they're in terms of tax to GDP ratio, in terms of expenditures on healthcare, education, they lead the world. So our whole notions of capitalism and socialism have been turned upside down.
Yeah, but there are alternatives. If you look at, you already mentioned Latin America, it has bucked the trend, the global trend. And then you also think about, I think we also have to be in the 21st century, think about new forms of resistance, because the old communist model had its own flaws. Remember, Soviet Union itself had very, very high levels of inequalities. So it's not the only case that, if you have a free market capitalism that's been rigged by big businesses, only you get this outcome. You can also have very unequal outcomes where you have a strong state, but one which has already been captured by apparatchiks and is underperforming. So I think people are more, if you look at the anti-globalization...
But many could argue that after the Soviet Union disintegrated, with the rise of the oligarchs, with the privatization of state-owned properties, Russia hasn't become more egalitarian.
Exactly. Yeah, that's true. That's true. That's absolutely true. But think about from 1999 onwards, I would say a reverse wave has started in history, which is, in a way, a course correction from the Genoa and the Seattle protests. The anti-globalization movement has in many ways captured in a new form. It's not the kind of old vanguard type of left that is, communist or socialist and is trying to put an alternative to capitalism. Rather, they are saying that we need something, and it's somewhat inchoate. Even through the last 5 years of the global economic crisis, we don't know what the outcome of Occupy Wall Street and indignados and, student protests in Chile and all these things will eventually lead up to. Okay. But certainly people are making the critique of globalization as having failed the majority of the people on the planet.
Dr. Chaulia, there are enough data which is coming from the United Nations which indicate that, India's performance as far as, the Human Development Index is concerned is pretty poor. In fact, if you look at the last data that came out, 2013, the Human Development Report of 2000, India ranked 136th. In 2011, we were like 134th. And when you adjust the Human Development Index for inequality, the index loses its value by as much as 29.3%. This is the studies that have been shown. And what is very, very clear is when you look at India, just a broad figures, If you look at our GDP as a whole, close to $2 trillion US, we are among the top 10 countries in the world, some people would rank us as 10, some people would rank as 6 or 8. But when you look at per capita income, you divide the total GDP or national income by the number of people, the 1.2 or 1.3 billion people who live here, we come crashing down. We are 140, 149 or 150 in the world, the way the Indian economy has evolved in the recent past.
There are a couple of variables here, Paranjay. One is what we call the logic category of emerging economies. The problem with the narrative about emerging economies the last 15 years, including China, India, and a few others, the BRICS plus, and then
Brazil,
how we have
Russia,
missed and so
South
on.
Africa.
You see that they do suffer from this problem across the board, more or less. The second variable is of democracies. Most of the BRIC economies, if you keep China out, are also democratic. And what has been happening is that the thick conception of democracy which used to exist, which was on the notion that it is not only political freedom, but also doing something about creating more equal wealth distribution in society, that has gone out of the window. So ideationally, now, the thin conception of democracy, which used to be the liberal one of Schumpeter downwards, where they said, as long as there are periodic elections, the distributional outcome should not matter. But what we see is a colossal failure of the democracies we call in these emerging economies. So the celebration of emerging economies, I think, has been overdone over the last 10-15 years, and it was done primarily to give investors advice to where to put their money for getting quick
India, China, 40% of the world's population, fastest growing economies.
This was for private equity firms and these investment vehicles that have been created in these big financial centers around the world, from Singapore in the east all the way up to Wall Street, Frankfurt, and all of them. So the emerging economy story, which in a way we have also lapped up, because to an extent it is true that national power we have accumulated, and
it's great for our national ego
some relative
to say, we are now an emerging economy, we are holding our head.
Exactly.
We want to be a member, a permanent member of the Security Council and so on and so forth.
We can't be ignored, that's true. But if you break down the unit of measurement away from nation state and start looking at people as a whole, then you realize that what's happening within these emerging economies is scandalous.
All right. Dr. Sreeram Chaulia, we know India has always been unequal from the days of the Rajas and the Maharajas. The Forbes list of billionaires lists 55 Indians who are billionaires in dollar terms in 2013 now. Interestingly, the net worth of the top 10 of them would roughly, it's about $100 billion. It's a little more than 5% of our GDP. That's one way of looking at it. 1 out of 3 software engineers on the planet is a person of Indian origin, but 1 out of 3 persons on this planet who's poor, who's hungry, who's illiterate is also from India. So we have this huge disparities. those maternal mortality indicators, those nutritional indicators, are worse than many of the African countries, the sub-Saharan countries, and not just Bangladesh. I mean, Bangladesh has done better, but if you look at Sudan, you look at Ethiopia,
the value of lives, human lives, has been demeaned so much that, it's now become, if you use a war terminology for globalization, this is all collateral damage. Because, there's growth happening, the big financial firms and their industrial firms that borrow from them are making profits, and so this has got to happen. Think about Rana Plaza disaster in Bangladesh. I mean, it's just one major, marker of what I'm talking about. 1,100 lives, so what? Gap and Walmart don't even care, and there's not enough of a movement within their countries to say that there is a global chain of exploitation. So the problem in developing countries is directly related to the massive power, political power, that's been captured by financial interests in advanced countries. So unless we are able to draw these linkages and create transnational movements of resistance, I'm afraid that this...
Are you not being excessively idealistic? The Occupy Wall Street movement that you talked about is virtually fizzled out. Okay, we might see in North Africa, we might see in West Asia these popular movements. We see a huge amount of churning that is taking place, but you're not seeing that much of this kind of a popular unrest against inequalities, against abuse of power in many parts of the world, including in India, you could argue.
Sure,
despite the Anna Hazare movement and despite the popular, discontent which keeps, spilling out on the streets, whether it be on account of a gang rape of a young woman in Delhi.
Sure, there are. I mean, the establishments have ways of preserving themselves and of containing and dispersing and dividing people. But then, if you think about it, I mean, going back to the Arab Spring, although the objective was to overthrow political, and to gain political freedom by overthrowing dictators.
Mubarak is out, Ben Ali is out, Gaddafi is out.
But the prelude to those was the massive food price inflation of 2008. If you remember, without that, the food riots that started in Egypt among miners and so on, 2008, 2009, without that you would not have 2011 when Mubarak was overthrown, right? So I think we must be open to possibility. There was a time when people, the World Bank, IMF were saying these are, stable societies and they're growing fast, and they were giving them, A grade, and see what happened. So I think, part of it has to do with the legitimization process of these, the appropriation that's been going on. And I think we need to delegitimize it and build the movements where people are saying, we have something in common with what's going on in Tunisia or what's going on in Washington.
Okay. The last word from you. We have very little time.
We need to build the notion of the interconnectedness of phenomena. We do it very well in social science, in intellectual circles. But I think that has to be, become mainstream. That's only the point when, we can say that we have commonalities with other people who have also been suffering in this global economic crisis. We may be from a developing country, but then there is something between us and the people in Spain and the people in parts of Latin America who are suffering.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Sreeram Chaulia.